Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It was the kind of sun-soaked July afternoon that made the beer taste better and the lies go down smoother. My cousin Nathan stood at the grill, pretending he knew how to cook, flipping dry-ass burgers with all the flair of a Food Network dropout, while Aunt Lisa shrieked about gluten like it was a terrorist group. The Price family reunion was in full swing, Hawaiian shirts, folding chairs, kids hopped up on Capri Sun, and fake-ass smiles plastered to every grown-up face like we were starring in a low-budget sitcom. And me? I had just arrived, 5 years late and 10 levels changed. They didn't see it yet, but they would. I parked at the far end of the cul-de-sac, behind a minivan with proud parent of an honor student and Blue Lives Matter slapped across its cracked bumper. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine off, watching people I used to love. People who had no idea what was coming. My hand hovered over the ignition again. Part of me still wanted to drive off, disappear, pretend this idea was just a fantasy. But another part, the one they created, fed, starved, and laughed at had waited too long for this. So I grabbed the cooler from the trunk, popped on my sunglasses, and walked toward the battlefield with a smile they'd all call polite. The backyard hadn't changed much. Same half-broken swing set that had nearly snapped when I was 12. Same scratchy plastic tablecloths blowing in the breeze, red Solo cups arranged like landmines across each table. The voices were loud, overlapping like waves, and none of them noticed me at first, not until Aunt Julie turned around and squinted. Then came the recognition, like a domino chain of plastic surprise. "Ethan," she said, her voice just loud enough to draw others in. "Oh my God, look who finally showed up." There's always that moment at family events, you know it, where the greetings are longer than the relationships ever were. Hugs from people who once forgot your birthday 3 years running. Polite questions layered in sugar but dipped in judgment. "So, what have you been up to these days? Still doing that tech stuff?" I could smell the curiosity under the fake concern. I kept it light, simple. Same stuff. Just wanted to see everyone again. That was a lie. I wanted to see them see me. There's a difference. It didn't take long before she appeared. My mother, Susan, in her element. Wearing her crisp white linen and that gold chain with the ruby pendant she only brought out when she wanted to remind people of her refined taste. She floated over like a politician canvassing voters, drink in one hand, judgment in the other. "Ethan," she said, drawing my name out like she wasn't quite sure she liked the taste of it. "You actually made it. David didn't mention you were coming." Of course he didn't. David didn't know. No one did. Now here's where I want to ask you something, and be honest. Have you ever walked into a room full of people who once laughed behind your back, only now they don't know whether to shake your hand or check your name tag? Have you ever let them simmer in that confusion, just a little longer than necessary? Because I did. And it was delicious. She hugged me, stiffly, like I was wrapped in thorns. Her perfume hadn't changed, powdery, expensive, suffocating. Her tone was just as I remembered, polite on the outside, pointed underneath. "I'm glad you found the time. You must be very busy these days." I nodded. You could say that. Her smile froze at the corners, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The way she looked at me was the same as always, half amused, half disappointed, like I was a stray cat that showed up on the porch with a mouse in its mouth. Useful, maybe, but not something you let in. David wasn't there yet. Of course he wasn't. David always showed up late so everyone could notice. Last I'd heard, he was still running his law firm, 3 kids, bought a boat, built a home gym, probably taught his dog to quote the Constitution. I used to care. I used to let that comparison eat me alive. Not anymore. "Ethan, come sit with us," Aunt Lisa waved me over. Her table had the sensible crowd, the ones who read their news on paper and complained about gas prices while driving new SUVs. Uncle Rob patted the seat beside him. "Got any of those weird business cards you used to pass out?" he joked. You always had something going on, right? I smiled, nodded. Not this time. Just here to eat and catch up. That was another lie. But I was getting good at those. Around me, conversations buzzed with the same old stories. Someone's kid got into some college. Someone's husband bought another motorcycle he'd never ride. Someone's neighbor had been stealing their recycling bins. It was surreal how little changed. How the same people who once called me too sensitive now argued about sunscreen brands like it was politics. But this wasn't about them. It was about her. And the stage was almost set. I helped myself to some lemonade and surveyed the yard. There, by the speakers, sat the projector. I had asked the rental company to drop it off that morning under the name Price Family Video Memories. Classic. No one had touched it yet. No one suspected a thing. You still single? That was Cousin Molly, smiling the way people do when they're not really asking. You were married for a while, right? My jaw tightened just slightly, but I kept the tone even. Was. A long time ago. She nodded, pretending she didn't already know. Everyone knew. Claire left when the money dried up. Left a note and a plant. Took the dog. Eventually, I wandered near the buffet, where Susan was praising the potato salad like it cured cancer. Her voice cut through the air, high and clipped. Some families just produce winners, she laughed. It's in the genes. Look at David. Laughter. I wasn't surprised. This was tradition. Praise David, nod politely at Ethan. Like I'd somehow snuck in through the side door of my own life. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger burned fast and left you empty. What I felt now was colder. Calculated. I had no interest in proving anything to her anymore. I just wanted her to see what she missed. To realize that while she was busy laughing, I was building. Quietly. Alone. The evening crept in slowly, and the drinks began to flow. Kids played tag near the fence, and the older cousins started arguing about fantasy football. David still hadn't arrived, but his shadow loomed large over every conversation. It always did. And me? I just waited. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Let them show their teeth. Because they had no idea that this reunion, this parade of pretenders, was about to end with the biggest show they'd never see coming. I was done playing small. They just didn't know it yet. There's something permanently bitter about the sound of your own mother laughing at your expense in public, especially when you're the only one who hears the knife behind the joke. I don't mean casual teasing, the kind families sometimes do out of affection or clumsy attempts at bonding. I mean that razor-edged mockery that slipped in between polite smiles and overcooked brisket, the kind of cruelty that's been rehearsed and delivered a dozen times, perfectly timed to remind you that you are, and always have been, the disappointment. And my mother? Susan Price could have taught seminars in it. It was always the same setup. A gathering, a crowd, a little too much Chardonnay in her glass, and David's name fresh on her tongue. David just closed a huge case last month, she'd beam, turning her face toward the nearest relative like a lighthouse swiveling toward praise. Senior partner now. His firm says he's up for managing director by next year. Then came the pause, the turn, and the afterthought that was me. And Ethan? Well, Ethan's always been very creative. That word. Creative. Said like a curse with a bow on top. Said like she was too tired to explain the failures out loud. I used to think maybe she didn't mean it the way it came out. Maybe she just didn't know how to express pride. But the older I got, the clearer it became. She meant every word. And more importantly, she enjoyed saying it. There was a kind of smug satisfaction on her face every time she made the comparison. Like she had birthed two sons just to have a walking example of right and wrong. I remember a wedding when I was 24, right after my first startup crashed and burned with the grace of a brick dropped from the roof of a 2-story house. I was broke, tired, and working nights at a bookstore downtown to keep the lights on in my 1-bedroom apartment. I showed up to the wedding alone, wearing a suit I'd borrowed from a thrift shop that didn't quite fit in the shoulders. David, meanwhile, was the best man, naturally. And during her toast, my mother managed to slip in this gem. Some families are just blessed with sons who know exactly what they want in life. And some sons are still figuring it out. Laughter followed. Even the DJ smirked. I didn't finish my drink that night. And then there was the funeral. My grandfather's. A somber, rainy afternoon where umbrellas outnumbered emotions and the food afterward was somehow still catered. Standing next to David as the priest droned on, my mother leaned over and whispered, "Your grandfather would have been proud of David. He's everything we hoped our family would become." No mention of me. No glance. Just that quiet, surgical cut, made in the middle of a eulogy. The thing is, I never expected her to be warm. But there's a difference between being emotionally distant and being actively dismissive. My entire childhood was built around being ignored until it was time to be corrected. I learned to be silent at the dinner table because speaking usually led to some variation of "don't talk about things you don't understand." I learned to do my homework not for praise, but to avoid her sighs. And birthdays? God, don't even get me started on birthdays. When I turned 10, I got a science kit I didn't ask for, with a card addressed to David, because she'd reused the wrong envelope. I remember holding that kit and realizing, in that one moment, that she hadn't even remembered who it was for. At 13, she forgot entirely. We went out to dinner 3 days later when she remembered. I got a slice of cake that was half frozen and an apology that sounded more like a schedule conflict. "It's just been such a busy week," she said, not even looking up from her purse. And somehow, through all of it, David could do no wrong. Even when he wrecked Dad's car at 17 and blamed it on the brakes, she defended him. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said. When I got a B+ in calculus, I got a lecture about distractions and wasted potential. There was this one Thanksgiving, maybe 15 years ago now, when David had just passed the bar and brought home a girl he'd only known for a month, blonde, vapid, clearly more interested in the ring than the man. Susan fawned over her like she was royalty. "Isn't she elegant?" she whispered to me in the kitchen while basting a turkey with more care than she'd ever shown me. David knows how to pick them. I, meanwhile, had just brought Claire for the first time. Claire, who, at that time, believed in me more than I did. Who stood by me when I had nothing but ideas and late-night coffee breath. And Susan? She called her plain. Said it just loud enough that Claire heard. But even Claire couldn't hold on forever. Years later, when the money was gone and the startup had failed, and the debt collectors started sniffing around like vultures, she packed up her stuff on a Tuesday and left before I got home. No fight. No tears. Just a note on the fridge that read, "You're not the man I married." And maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't. Or maybe I just never had a shot in hell of becoming that man because no one ever showed me how. Because every time I tried to build something, the people closest to me handed me a hammer and dared me to destroy it instead. Uncle Rob, of course, loved to stir the pot. So he said once, while flipping through a photo album like it was the gospel, "What's your plan now, Ethan? I always thought you'd be a teacher or something." I wanted to say, "Yeah, well, I always thought you'd grow a spine," but instead I just smiled. That same smile I gave at funerals and reunions, the one that said, "You have no idea what I'm building while you sleep." But the truth is, for a long time, I didn't know either. I was just chasing something validation, maybe. A seat at the table I never got invited to, a mother's nod, a brother's envy, a room where I wasn't the punchline. Now, standing here in the same backyard, hearing her voice float across the air like perfume and poison all at once, I know better. I'm not here to be accepted. I'm here to finish the damn story. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with a screen and a single click. Let her talk. Let her toast. Let her laugh at the good son, the successful son. Because the son she forgot about is the one who's about to flip the script. By the time the sun began leaning westward across the Price family's oversized backyard, the air had thickened with both heat and unspoken judgment. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of aging hips and bloated egos. The conversations took on that peculiar tone only family reunions know, one where questions are rarely innocent and praise is served with a side of passive aggression. I'd already made a loop around the yard twice, smiling just enough, nodding when necessary, laughing at stories I'd heard for decades, but never starred in. There was no point in correcting anyone. Let the myths live. Let them pretend I was still that kid with big ideas and no follow-through. After all, that's how they preferred me. Still working on that little app? That came from Cousin Derek, who never once held a real job that didn't involve a forklift or a cousin's garage. He said it with a smirk tucked neatly under his mustache, like he'd been waiting 5 years just to pull that line out of cold storage. I didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just kept stirring my iced tea with a cracked straw and said, still working on a few things. Quietly. The word quietly hung in the air like smoke. He didn't notice. Most people don't. Nearby, Uncle Gary was recounting, for the 4th time in 20 minutes, how he had almost been recruited by the Cubs back in '78 before the knee went. Everyone at the table nodded solemnly, as if the Cubs management team still lost sleep over it. Gary caught my eye and gave me the same look he'd given since I was old enough to understand what disappointment felt like, sympathy mixed with doubt. You ever think about going back to school? He asked, in that voice old men use when they think they're being helpful but are really just trying to sand down your self-respect. I've heard tech jobs are pretty tough if you don't know coding and all that. I nodded, the smile never leaving. That's true. Lot of tough stuff out there. I didn't bother explaining the code I'd written at 2 in the morning after working shifts at a convenience store. Didn't bring up the frameworks or the back-end systems or the sleepless nights staring into glowing screens, rewriting entire systems because one patch update broke everything. Didn't bring up the years of work that went into building something lean enough to survive failure and strong enough to scale. Why would I? To these people, ambition was just a cute phase, like braces or guitar lessons. What gets you isn't the big insults, it's the small ones, the 1,000 paper cuts of indifference. It's being called kiddo when you're 36. It's the pat on the shoulder from an uncle who once asked to borrow money for a jet ski but still calls your work whatever it is you do online. It's your cousin's wife asking if you're still renting while she scrolls Zillow listings on a phone her husband doesn't realize she's using to message her ex. These people, God bless them, don't even realize how much they bleed you. Or maybe they do. Maybe they enjoy it. There's this moment every reunion when the table fills out just enough, and the noise dies down just slightly, and someone proposes a toast. It's not a tradition, exactly, more of a habit. Usually a joke toast, usually someone like Cousin Jeff holding a plastic cup half filled with cheap wine, shouting something like, to family, because we don't get to choose them. Everyone laughs because they're supposed to. I chuckled too, but for different reasons. I didn't choose them, no. But I had chosen to return. And every second I was here, that choice weighed heavier than the heat in the air. Across the table, Aunt Cheryl whispered something to Susan, something I couldn't hear but didn't need to. Cheryl always whispered when it was about me. I saw Susan give a tight little shrug, her mouth curling in that signature expression that said, "What can you do?" As if I was some long-term condition, manageable but unfixable. And that, more than anything, reminded me why I'd spent the last 5 years building something no one else knew existed. Because some people keep their promises, and some people keep their receipts. The kids were playing now, screaming in the distance near the sprinkler, soaked shirts clinging to small backs as they slid across the grass like little human missiles. I watched them for a second, not because I cared particularly, but because they were the only honest ones here. Kids don't lie unless we teach them how. Give it 20 years and half of them will be seated at this same table, repeating the same jokes, the same stories, sipping the same lukewarm iced tea. Claire would have hated this. She always did. The one time she came, she left after an hour and sat in the car with the AC on, scrolling through job listings on her phone. She said it felt like being trapped in someone else's idea of what success was supposed to look like, plastic chairs, polyester smiles, and men bragging about golf scores like they'd won a war. I didn't understand it back then. I do now. Still no kids, huh? That one came from a second cousin I couldn't name without checking a family tree. The kind who shows up once a decade and thinks that qualifies her to comment on your reproductive choices. No, I said, sipping again, I haven't found a way to clone myself yet. She blinked, unsure if I was joking. I smiled wider. Maybe next up. They laughed politely. I didn't. Because behind every polite laugh, I heard it again, that quiet chorus that plays in families like this. You could have been more. You should have been more. You weren't enough. You're still not. And here's the thing about hearing something long enough. It becomes familiar. And familiar things stop hurting. Instead, they harden you. Turn you into something else entirely. Something sharper. As night began to stretch its legs across the yard, the projector sat untouched near the trellis, still covered by a tarp and ignorance. No one noticed it. No one cared. That was fine. The surprise would taste better after dessert. I didn't need validation anymore. I didn't even want it. What I wanted was clarity. For once, I wanted them to see not who I could have been, but who I became in the absence of their belief. Because failure had a seat at the table, sure. But this time, failure was just the disguise. And underneath it, something far more dangerous had grown. Something they would all soon see. And none of them were ready. Not even close. There are silences that hum like the quiet before a storm, heavy and charged with invisible weight, and then there are silences that stretch so long and so wide you begin to forget what your own voice sounds like inside them. The second kind is the one I lived in for nearly a decade. Not out loud, not dramatic, not the kind you write songs about or shout into therapy sessions. This silence wasn't loud enough to hear. It was just always there, like humidity or grief, coating everything in the background of my days. It followed me from job to job, from couch to mattress on the floor, through empty apartments with peeling walls and slow drains, from early morning bus stops to lonely midnight coding marathons that felt like digging a tunnel with a spoon. After Claire left, I told everyone it was mutual, that we just drifted apart, that it was nobody's fault. But the truth was far simpler and far colder. She was tired of believing in something that never seemed to arrive. And really, who could blame her? We used to dream together, her curled up next to me on the second-hand futon, both of us talking about cities we'd moved to once things took off. I'd show her wireframes and pitch decks at 2 a.m. like a kid showing off a drawing he hoped would make the fridge. For a while, she played along. Then slowly, her eyes dulled. Her questions turned into silences of their own. And then one day, the future we planned just didn't show up, and neither did she. The apartment felt bigger after she left, but not in a good way. Echoes lingered longer. The sound of keys hitting the counter made me flinch. I stopped buying groceries for 2. Stopped eating meals that required effort. Ramen became currency. I knew which stores marked down the manager's special eggs, and when the vending machine in the basement of my temp job would glitch and spit out 2 Cokes for the price of 1. There was no room for pride. Pride doesn't pay electric bills or feed a man whose code keeps crashing every 5th line. Pride doesn't make your mother call you back or undo the voicemail your brother left offering a real job if you're tired of chasing smoke. I worked jobs that scraped the last bit of shine off my 20s. Night cashier at a 24-hour gas station, warehouse stocker for a company that sold surplus baby products, dishwasher at a bar that smelled like regret and bleach. Each one was temporary, a means to an end that hadn't shown its face yet. During the day, I worked. During the night, I built. Always alone. Always in silence. No co-founder anymore. Not after Brent walked. Brent was supposed to be the other half of the dream, the numbers guy, the pitchman, the extrovert who could talk investors into backing a business plan drawn on a cocktail napkin. We'd started together in a shared office the size of a walk-in closet, scribbling ideas on the windows because we couldn't afford whiteboards. He was slick, charming, the type of guy my mother would have preferred as a second son. But charm without patience is a dangerous thing. And when the early funding dried up and the product delays stacked like bodies in a war, Brent disappeared like smoke under a door. One day he was pushing new partnerships, the next he was ghosting calls and whispering to a competitor. I should have seen it coming. I'd noticed the late-night emails, the sudden NDA he asked me to sign just in case, the locked drawers in his desk. But I didn't want to believe the one person who had seen something in me, who had said he saw it, would walk the second the storm hit. But he did, left me with broken code, a bitter lease, and a debt spiral that nearly drowned me. I almost gave up then. The first time. The second time came a year later, when my laptop died 2 days before a pitch call I had spent 6 months preparing for. I was behind on rent. I hadn't spoken to my family in over a year. My friends, the ones who still called, had long stopped asking if I wanted to do something. I remember staring at that black screen, knowing I couldn't afford another device, knowing the deadline was immovable. I sat there in the dark and wept like a man who finally realized no one was coming to save him. Not Claire. Not Brent. Not even me. I slept on the floor that night with the windows open and the cold air biting through the holes in the curtains. The third time was quiet, the scariest kind. No tragedy, no betrayal, no catastrophic failure. Just a Tuesday. I had spent 18 hours debugging a user flow that refused to resolve, and somewhere around 3 in the morning I simply stopped moving. Stared at the screen. Watched the cursor blink. And felt nothing. No panic. No rage. Just a weight behind the eyes and a quiet little whisper that said, maybe it's time to quit. And that voice didn't sound like weakness, it sounded like relief. But something pulled me back, and I don't mean hope. I mean bitterness. Pure, unfiltered, jet-black bitterness. The memory of my mother's voice at that wedding. The echo of David's smug laugh when he offered me a contract job under him if I needed something reliable. The way Claire's note said, I used to be full of light, like I was some dead star now collapsing in on itself. Those voices kept me alive. Kept me typing. Kept me dreaming. Not in some noble, cinematic way. I didn't want to inspire anyone. I wanted to outlive the version of me they kept pointing at. I wanted to succeed in the dark. Quietly. With no applause. The version of the company that survived was nothing like the one Brent and I dreamed up. It was leaner, meaner, quieter. I didn't pitch to tech bros or investors in Patagonia vests. I sold to people like me, small business owners, burned-out freelancers, lone wolves who needed tools but couldn't afford a team. The product didn't look flashy, but it worked. And slowly, steadily, the revenue ticked upward. 10 clients. Then 50. Then 100. All without a single email to my family. And through it all, I stayed silent. No birthday updates. No holiday cards. No humble brags on Facebook. I disappeared on purpose. Because the silence they once gave me, I learned how to weaponize it. And I knew one day it would speak louder than any toast or title or fake-ass smile ever could. There's always that moment in every family gathering, you can practically time it to the minute, when the energy shifts and the air tightens, like someone just turned a dial labeled hierarchy up to maximum volume. For the Price family, that moment arrived with the screech of clean tires on warm concrete and the mechanical purr of an overwaxed luxury SUV, the kind of car you lease for the image and expense for the tax write-off. Out stepped David, freshly pressed and half a beat late, because of course he was. David didn't arrive on time. David made his arrival. And like clockwork, the crowd reacted. I watched the collective posture of the backyard shift, watched heads turn and faces light up like someone just dropped a Hollywood actor into a suburban block party. Even the kids stopped throwing wet grass at each other long enough to glance over, which was saying something, because those kids didn't pause for anything less than fireworks or a skin knee. Uncle Rob muttered something about lookin' sharp, and someone else clapped as if David had just returned from war instead of a climate-controlled office downtown, where the most danger he faced was a paper cut or a gluten-heavy catered lunch. He looked exactly how I remembered him, only more polished, more calculated, like someone playing the role of successful son on a daytime soap. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, because that's the new power move now, a watch that screamed subtle wealth, and that same goddamn smile that hadn't changed since high school debate team. He made his way through the yard like a preacher at a revival, shaking hands, patting backs, calling everyone by name even if he didn't remember their birthdays, asking questions that sounded personal but weren't. Still coaching Little League, Brian? How's the business, Derek? That was flooring, right? He didn't wait for answers. He just moved on, his charisma dragging behind him like an expensive cologne. And then, like the sun rising over a carefully curated shrine, he reached our mother. Susan Price lit up in a way she reserved only for two things: high-status relatives and people she believed made her look better by proximity. Her arms opened wide as if the prodigal son had returned, though in this version of the story, he was never really gone, just perpetually elevated. "There he is," she said, her voice just a little louder than necessary, so it carried across the yard like a public service announcement. "My David, you're finally here. Everyone's been waiting." Which wasn't true, of course. No one had said a damn thing about him being late. But now that he was here, they would act like they had. David kissed her cheek with all the grace of a politician visiting a campaign donor's house and handed her a small gift bag, probably overpriced lotion or wine she already owned, but she received it like it was the Ark of the Covenant. "I was just telling everyone about your new firm," she added, beaming at the surrounding crowd like a school principal announcing Student of the Year. "He's taking on major clients now. Government contracts. High-level stuff." She turned to Cousin Cheryl. "I keep telling him to take a break, but he's just so driven." Driven. That was the word. Always driven. Meanwhile, I was always drifting. I watched the exchange from a few steps away, sipping my iced tea like it was bourbon and wishing it was. Nobody acknowledged me, not in that moment, and I didn't expect them to. That moment wasn't mine. It never had been. I had stopped looking for a seat at their table years ago. Instead, I'd built my own table made of rough wood, sweat, and late-night code. But still, something inside me twisted as I watched my mother clutch his arm and laugh like they were sharing an inside joke about how the rest of us had peaked too early or failed to show up at all. He spotted me, eventually. Couldn't avoid it. I was too close to ignore, even for someone trained in the art of selective blindness. "Ethan," he said, flashing the grin that had charmed investors and judges alike. "Look at you, man. It's been what for? 5 years?" He said it like I'd been on a vacation instead of clawing my way through rock bottom. "How's everything going?" "Still doing the tech thing." Still. That word. Like I'd been tinkering in a garage with no roof and less purpose. "Still plugging away," I said, returning his grin with one I kept in storage for moments like this. "You know how it is." Quiet grind. That seemed to satisfy him. Not because it answered anything, but because it told him I wasn't a threat, not yet, anyway. He turned back toward the others before I could say more. That was his rhythm: acknowledge, affirm, abandon. He didn't linger unless there was value in it. And I'd never been valuable enough to hold his attention. But that would change. Soon. Watching him was like watching a performance you'd memorized by heart, one you used to try out for before realizing the casting was rigged. He was the golden son, the one they all imagined when they whispered hopes into birthday candles or wrote college checks with shaky hands. I was the B-roll, the shadow, the accidental echo of someone else's legacy. But there was a difference now, a small, invisible crack in the script. Because I wasn't bitter anymore. Not like before. What I felt wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. I wasn't here to steal the spotlight. I was here to rewire it, aim it somewhere unexpected, and let the truth do what truth always does when it's been bottled for too long: explode. So I let this scene unfold. Let him soak in the adoration. Let her cling to his arm like he was the living proof she hadn't wasted her life. I played my role, the quiet one, the polite one, the still working on it one. all while knowing something he didn't. There was a file on my phone, a video, a headline, a valuation. I'd checked it before I got out of the car, not because I didn't believe it, but because some victories are so long coming you have to stare at them a while to trust they're real. And when I looked at it, when I read those numbers, it wasn't pride I felt. It was relief. Cold and clean. He would know soon. They all would. But not yet. Let the perfect son have his parade. Let him toast. Let him bask. Because the silence I had lived in for so long was almost over. And the first thing they were going to hear when it broke was me. The sun had begun to melt into the horizon by the time the food hit the tables, casting a long amber haze across the backyard that made everything look warmer than it actually was. There's always a certain false intimacy at family dinners like these, especially at reunions. The folding chairs creak under the weight of nostalgia, the paper plates bend too easily under potato salad and smoked ribs, and everyone starts to pretend, just for a moment, that they've always loved each other. Laughter becomes louder, conversations become lighter, and the same stories get retold with slightly exaggerated endings. People drink a little too quickly, pass casseroles with forced grins, and toast things they don't understand, like how far we've all come or how blessed we are to be together. When most of them hadn't spoken in 2 years and didn't plan to again until someone died. By the time everyone was seated, the long plastic banquet tables were cluttered with condiments, red cups, sweating pitchers of iced tea, and the usual buffet of carbs and cholesterol. David sat next to our mother, naturally, flanked by the uncles and cousins who hovered around him like interns at a firm, waiting for him to drop a gem of wisdom or at least a decent joke. I had taken a seat 2 tables down, alone at first, before one of the smaller cousins wandered over to sit beside me and play with a napkin until their mom called them back. No one else made a move to join me. That wasn't new. Dinner carried on with the usual clatter of plates and utensils, conversations overlapping and bouncing across the tables, most of them swirling around jobs, sports, kids, or the weather. Occasionally, someone would throw me a bone, a question about whether I still lived in that same place downtown, or if I was still doing the software stuff, but they never stuck around for the answer. The moment I responded with anything more than a yes or no, they'd look away, nod politely, and go back to their comfort zones, where David's accomplishments were easier to digest than my silence. Then came the part everyone pretended to dread, but secretly waited for: the toasts. It always started innocently enough. A cousin raised their cup and offered a clumsy, heartfelt thank you to the older generation, which prompted a second toast from someone else thanking the hosts, which bled into a third toast about how crazy this family is, but we love each other anyway. All of it was fine, expected, warm in the way store-bought apple pie is warm. But then Susan stood up. No one asked her to. No one needed her to. She just did, as if it were a given that the matriarch would bless the meal not just with her food, but with her words. She held her wine glass like it was a scepter and waited for the room to hush. And it did, almost instantly, because when Susan Price stood to speak, people shut their mouths and adjusted their posture. I watched her from my seat, leaned back just slightly, arms folded, face blank. I just want to say, she began, her voice calm and controlled like she was addressing a fundraiser crowd, how incredibly proud I am of this family. Every year, I look around this table and see more growth, more success, more proof that we were built to persevere. She let that sit for a moment, her eyes scanning the table like a general taking roll call. We're a strong family, full of hard workers, achievers, and yes, I'll say it, winners. Some people in this family, she said, tilting her glass toward David with a smile that looked like it had been rehearsed in the mirror, were born to shine. I already knew what was coming next. I saw it in the tilt of her head, the way her smile curved slightly sharper at one edge. I'd seen that expression my entire life, in grocery stores, at parent-teacher meetings, in the glances she gave me when I came home without a trophy or with a participation ribbon. It was the look of a woman who believed in meritocracy, as long as the merit came in one very specific, very traditional form. And others, she continued, her tone dipping just enough to shift the temperature of the air. Well, some just weren't meant to succeed. A few chuckles followed. Light, nervous, scattered. Not loud enough to be cruel. Just soft enough to be complicit. I could see the uncomfortable glances passed between in-laws and cousins, a few of them shifting in their seats, pretending not to know who she was referring to. But everyone did. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. I didn't flinch. Didn't laugh. Didn't reach for a drink or respond with a witty retort. Instead, I stood up. Slowly, calmly. Not a single plate clattered or cup tipped. I walked away from the table, away from the spotlight she had hijacked, and made my way across the yard toward the small platform by the trellis, the one where the projector sat under its canvas tarp. There were murmurs behind me. A few people whispering. A cousin asking, "What's he doing?" Uncle Rob made a low joke about me storming off. Susan's voice called out faintly, "Ethan," in that performative tone that carried more judgment than concern. I didn't answer. I just reached for the projector, removed the tarp, and powered it on. It buzzed to life with a mechanical hum, casting a wide blue glow onto the sheet I had hung across the side fence earlier that day. They all turned to look. Slowly, at first. Like they couldn't quite process what was happening. Some stood. Some stayed seated. David narrowed his eyes. Susan frowned, wine glass still suspended in midair. The screen flickered once, then settled. A news headline appeared. Then another. CNBC, Bloomberg, Wired. Then a video clip, me, standing beside two executives in tailored suits, shaking hands beneath a bold banner that read, "Velocity Systems acquires Nimbus Forge for $86 million. My company, my platform, my deal." The murmurs stopped. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a fly blink. I turned slowly to face them. Every last person who had ever doubted, dismissed, or degraded me. And with the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "Some of us weren't meant to succeed, until we did." Then I smiled. Not for them. Not to prove anything. Just because it felt good to let the silence belong to me for once. And in that moment, that cold, breathless, electric moment, everything they thought they knew about me collapsed under the weight of what they never bothered to ask. The moment the projector lit up the fence with a bright blue glow, the entire atmosphere of the backyard shifted from casual cookout to something just a little more electric, a little more cinematic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Paper plates paused halfway to mouths. The laughter, easy, automatic, cruel, stopped as if someone had hit a mute button. What had once been just another family reunion with lukewarm beer and too many opinions suddenly felt like the opening scene of a movie they hadn't been invited to star in. And I didn't say a word at first. I didn't need to. The first thing to appear on screen was the CNBC headline, the kind that doesn't even look real the first time you see your name in it. Nimbus Forge acquired by Velocity Systems for $86 million. The font was clean, the logo unmistakable, and the subheadline beneath it more satisfying than any applause I could have gotten from this backyard audience. One-man startup becomes surprise tech acquisition of the quarter. My photo appeared, a candid shot from the press conference, me in a dark blazer, flanked by two men in $1,000 suits who'd spent the week pretending they discovered me when all they'd really done was finally notice. There were gasps. Honest-to-God gasps. The kind people usually reserve for engagements or pregnancies, or catching a glass before it falls. I turned to look at the crowd, my family, my blood, my audience, and for the first time in years, I felt not anger, not even pride, but absolute stillness. That sharp, weightless clarity you only get after a storm's passed and you're still standing. There was David, jaws set but unreadable, eyes flicking from the screen to me like he was trying to recalibrate something internal that had always placed him at the center of the map. There was Susan, her smile frozen in that halfway curl that had always meant one of two things, disbelief or disapproval, and right now I wasn't sure which it was. The next slide hit harder. Investor portfolios. Graphs. Market data. All real. All verifiable. A cascade of credibility. My work. My code. My name, not David's, not Brent's, not anyone else's, appearing across financial news tickers and tech blogs and software industry reports. I had put this together not to brag, not to gloat, but to prove, not just to them, but maybe to myself, that I had actually done it. That the long nights and empty fridges and ignored birthdays and burned bridges hadn't all just led to a quiet breakdown in a rented apartment with no air conditioning. I let them take it in for another few seconds. Let it sit heavy in the air like summer heat before a thunderstorm. Then I stepped forward, stood next to the screen with one hand casually in my pocket, and finally spoke. To family, I said, my voice steady and louder than expected. Especially the ones who said I couldn't. I looked at Susan when I said it, and she knew. Everyone did. Someone tried to start a clap, then stopped. Another murmured, "Holy shit," under their breath, and it carried just loud enough to feel like the only honest thing anyone had said all day. David didn't speak. Didn't move. He just watched me, frozen, like he had just realized he'd missed something important and couldn't go back to fix it. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the part where I raised a drink, everyone awkwardly cheered, and I took a slow, satisfied walk into some metaphorical sunset of vindication. But real life doesn't work like that. Stories don't end clean. Because no matter how hard you try to control the moment, something always breaks through the edges. The first break came as a buzz in my pocket, a phone call I had been avoiding all day. I didn't even look at the screen because I knew who it was. You don't spend years building something out of nothing without making a few enemies, or at the very least, leaving behind people who want a piece of it now that it's real. I ignored the call. Let it vibrate against my leg like a warning shot. Then the buzz came again, a second call, a different number, same purpose. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and gave the crowd one more polite smile. But something in my jaw had clenched tight. Then came the envelope. It was sitting in my jacket, the one I had slung over the projector table earlier that afternoon. White, slim, heavy with the weight of something I didn't want to read yet, a letter from a former partner's lawyer, most likely, or maybe from the father I hadn't heard from in almost 15 years. I didn't open it. Not now. Not in front of them. But just feeling it there, pressing against the fabric of the only suit I owned that didn't come from a thrift store, reminded me that success doesn't show up clean and tied with a bow. It shows up with baggage, old wounds, new problems. Behind the applause, which had finally started in scattered, confused bursts, I heard the shift. The sideways glances. The whispers. The sudden recalculations. They weren't celebrating. Not really. They were adjusting. Trying to make sense of what it meant now that the loser they'd brushed off for decades was the one holding the mic. And I knew that later, behind closed doors or over text threads I wasn't part of, they would say things like, well, tech money comes and goes, or let's see if he can hold on to it. Because it's easier to discredit a win than to confront what your doubt might have cost someone. I stepped down from the makeshift stage without waiting for Susan to say anything. She wouldn't. Not today. Maybe not ever. Her world didn't include space for the possibility that the child she'd written off might have outgrown the story she'd been telling about him for years. Her pride had no room for revision. David approached me slowly, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. So, he said, drawing the word out like it owed him something, guess I owe you a drink. I shrugged. You owe me a hell of a lot more than that. He didn't argue. Just nodded, eyes narrowing, like he was trying to figure out if the game was over or if it had just begun again with new rules. The projector flickered one more time and went dark. And I stood there, in the middle of this strange silence, not triumphant, not broken, just done. Done chasing approval. Done shrinking to fit their comfort. Done explaining myself to people who'd never asked the right questions. And yet, behind that stillness, something gnawed quietly, a truth I didn't want to say out loud, not even to myself. Because even after the deal, even after the headlines and the valuation and the disbelief, I still didn't feel what I thought I would. Because winning, when no one ever thought you would, doesn't fill the empty rooms you built your victory in. It just echoes louder. The applause, if you could even call it that, came in soft, irregular waves like the dying tide after a storm that no one saw coming, but everyone pretended they were prepared for. A few claps from cousins who hadn't spoken to me in a decade. A raised cup from Uncle Rob, who smirked like he was trying to act unfazed, like $86 million wasn't enough to rattle whatever basement-level expectations he'd quietly held onto. David, ever the diplomat, clapped slowly, too slowly, as if he needed the delay to rewrite the narrative in his head. As if he couldn't quite square the man he remembered with the man standing in front of a blank projector screen that had just swallowed the air from every conversation in the yard. And my mother? Susan said nothing at all. She sat down without a word, her glass untouched, her posture too perfect to be relaxed and too tight to be gracious. She didn't look at me again, not fully, not the way a mother looks at her son when she's proud or confused or afraid of what comes next. Instead, she focused on the food in front of her, pushing green beans around the plate with a fork she barely lifted, as if pretending she had something else to focus on would be enough to erase what she had just seen. I didn't sit back down. I didn't rejoin the table or make another speech or take a victory lap around the grill. I just stood there, letting the silence wrap around me like a jacket in the wrong season, watching the people I'd spent my entire life trying to impress squirm under the weight of their own doubt. It wasn't satisfying. Not the way you'd think. There was no sweet revenge, no emotional payoff, no swelling music or slow-motion montage where I embraced my destiny. Just cold facts and colder faces. Just a realization that by the time I had finally won, there was no one left in the audience whose approval I still wanted. And that was the worst part of all. They started clearing the tables soon after, moving plates and cups with all the awkward energy of people desperate to return to something familiar, something safe. Conversations started up again, stilted and unconvincing, like children trying to pretend they hadn't just broken something fragile. They talked about sports, traffic, and who was going to host the next reunion, as if my announcement had been a weather update rather than a tectonic shift in everything they thought they knew about me. No one asked questions. No one congratulated me beyond the polite, performative nods you give someone who got a haircut you don't quite like, but don't want to comment on. David tried, I'll give him that. He pulled me aside near the garage and said something about partnerships, opportunities, maybe even reconnecting now that we're both in places where we can help each other. I smiled, nodded, gave him the exact amount of polite interest I knew he'd expect, and left it at that. Because there was nothing for me in that relationship anymore, not trust, not rivalry, not even resentment. It was just noise now. And Susan? She passed me once on the way to the trash bin, wine glass still in hand, and she paused just long enough to look at me from the side, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, anything. But then she didn't. She just shook her head, barely, almost imperceptibly, and kept walking. Maybe she was disappointed. Maybe she was confused. Maybe, in some twisted corner of her mind, she still believed that success without her approval didn't really count. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. I had learned how to stop waiting for her validation, though I hadn't yet figured out how to stop wanting it. By the time the sun dipped behind the neighbor's roof and the cicadas began their mechanical song, most of the guests had started to drift toward their cars. The kids were chasing each other across the damp grass, barefoot and sticky with melted popsicles, and the air smelled like citronella and charcoal. I stood near the edge of the driveway, watching the scene unfold like I wasn't part of it, like I was some observer looking in from the outside, and in a way, I was. Because that's where success had left me. Not at the center of the celebration, but orbiting it, like a satellite programmed to return home long after the party ended. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, small, high-pitched, innocent in that painful way only children can be. It was my cousin's boy, 7 or 8 maybe, standing by the picnic table with one hand clutching a juice box and eyes full of something I hadn't seen all day, Are you rich now? He asked, loud enough for a few heads to turn, but not loud enough to cause another scene. I stopped, turned around slowly, looked him in the eyes, then glanced at the adults behind him, some pretending not to listen, others frozen in that strange mix of curiosity and embarrassment. And I smiled, a tired, heavy smile, and said, "Rich enough to know it doesn't fix much." He blinked, not understanding, but he nodded anyway, as if he had learned something without knowing what it meant yet. Maybe he'd remember it later. Maybe he wouldn't. And then I walked away. Down the driveway, past the cars, out into the street where the air was cooler and the noise of the reunion faded behind me. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already looked back too many times in my life and never once found anything worth staring at. The envelope in my jacket still pressed against my ribs like a warning, and the phone in my pocket buzzed again with a number I didn't want to answer. There were new problems now. Legal ones. Personal ones. Ethical ones. Success wasn't clean. It wasn't pure. It wasn't even really mine. It was just the sum of everything I had lost trying to survive the people who said I wouldn't make it. And maybe they were right. Maybe I hadn't made it the way they meant. Maybe I had just become something harder, colder, less human in the process. The kind of man who builds something brilliant, but only to prove a point. The kind of man who shows his worth not through connection, but through consequence. Or maybe, just maybe, I had finally broken free. Either way, I was alone again. And this time, the silence didn't bother me. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it was mine now. All of it,